royal jewels are more than glittering treasures. They are symbols of history, legacy, and power passed down through generations. So when whispers spread that Queen Camilla intended to auction off one of Queen Elizabeth's most valuable and cherished tiaras, the reaction inside the palace was explosive. Princess Anne, known for her fierce loyalty to her mother's memory, was reportedly furious at what she saw as a betrayal of tradition and respect. Could this decision spark the deepest royal rift yet between Camilla and Anne? A crown's silent betrayal. It began quietly, almost too quietly, with murmurs spreading through palace corridors after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Whispers of missing jewels seemed like nothing more than idle gossip at first, quickly brushed aside by those unwilling to imagine scandal so soon after a monarch's death. But soon the rumors hardened into troubling signs that could no longer be ignored. The heart of the storm erupted when Queen Camilla, allegedly, moved to place one of Elizabeth's most valuable treasures, a historic diamond tiara valued at more than $15 million, into a private auction. The revelation sent shockwaves through the royal household, and none felt the sting more deeply than Princess Anne. Known for her unwavering loyalty and her fierce devotion to her mother's legacy, Anne saw this not simply as a financial transaction, but as a wound to Elizabeth's memory itself.
Most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Elizabeth II.
The tiara, once a symbol of continuity and tradition, was being reduced to an item with a price tag, destined to leave royal hands forever. What made the outrage burn even brighter was the suggestion that this was not the first time such a move had occurred. Reports began surfacing that Camilla had quietly arranged the sale of other heirlooms in the past, slipping them into discreet auctions under assumed ownership. The secrecy was staggering. These were not trinkets tucked away in forgotten vaults, but treasures that carried with them the weight of history and the emotional threads of generations. If the reports were true, Camilla had already pocketed untold sums while ensuring the transactions remained far from public scrutiny. Princess Anne was not alone in her anger. The list of missing items began to circulate in hushed conversations, each piece stirring new waves of disbelief. Among them was a Victorian diamond brooch that once dazzled under candlelight at formal banquets, a sapphire necklace cherished from glittering state occasions, and an emerald choker with deep connections to monarchs of long ago. Even Diana's iconic pearls, forever tied to her image in the public's imagination, were said to have vanished in the aftermath of Elizabeth's death. Each jewel told a story, not just of wealth, but of moments that defined the crown's image across decades. To see them disappear without a trace was not only financially alarming, it was emotionally devastating. For Anne, every missing heirloom was another piece of her mother's life being stripped away, another chapter of royal memory erased under the guise of secrecy. The palace was left with an unsettling question, one that seemed to echo louder with every new report of a vanished jewel. Where were these priceless treasures going, and who was truly benefiting? The answer, still hidden behind layers of speculation and silence, carried the potential to upend the monarchy's fragile image of unity. And at the center of it all stood two women, one guarding her mother's memory with unshakable resolve, and the other accused of turning history itself into currency. And what if the vanished jewels were more than treasures? Could they expose a betrayal deep enough to shatter the monarchy's fragile unity forever? Stay with us. The Vault of Secrets. The whispers of missing jewels had already unsettled the palace, but what came next transformed rumor into something far more dangerous. A whistleblower stepped forward, shattering the fragile silence. This insider claimed the treasures were not lost at all, but deliberately hidden. According to their testimony, Queen Camilla had moved them into a private vault at her Wiltshire estate, Raymill House, far from the official records, far from royal accountability. It was a revelation as damning as it was explosive, one that painted the disappearance not as carelessness, but as a calculated act of concealment. For Princess Anne, this was the turning point. Suspicion hardened into resolve. and her fury became a mission. Known throughout the kingdom for her no-nonsense approach and unshakable loyalty, Anne refused to let her mother's legacy be reduced to whispers and shadows. She quietly gathered a small circle of trusted allies, men and women who had served her late mother with loyalty and discretion. Among them were royal protection officers, who had once stood watch over Elizabeth herself. Together, they began piecing fragments of evidence that told a darker story. Photographs of the jewels, mysteriously absent from the official archives, began to surface. Delivery logs revealed strange movements of unmarked packages. Testimonies from household staff hinted at late-night transfers overseen personally by Camilla. One butler, speaking under the shield of anonymity, recalled being ordered to transport boxes from Clarence house to Mill under the strictest instructions. No questions, no hesitation. Each lead, each discovery, pushed Anne closer to the same conclusion. These heirlooms had not been misplaced by time. They had been deliberately removed from royal custody. The scale of what she uncovered was staggering. Certain high-profile auctions across Europe and the Middle East had begun showcasing rare jewels that bore uncanny resemblances to pieces recorded in the royal collection. Rings, brooches, and necklaces, once photographed as part of Elizabeth's treasure, were now appearing under the guise of anonymous ownership. Expert jewelers quietly confirmed Anne's worst suspicions. The craftsmanship, the cuts of the stones, even the settings matched pieces known to have belonged to the Queen. Though Camilla's name was nowhere on the paperwork, the timing of these sales aligned almost perfectly with the jewels' disappearance from Windsor and Buckingham Palace inventories. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Every detail, every transaction pointed to a quiet siphoning of history, orchestrated under layers of secrecy and shielded by silence. Even more troubling was the treatment of those who dared question the strange movements. Several staff members who had raised concerns were abruptly dismissed, while others were pressured into silence with veiled threats or sudden transfers. The culture of fear suggested something deeper than personal carelessness. It hinted at a system designed to protect whoever was pulling the strings. For Anne, the weight of it all was crushing. These were not just jewels. They were symbols of continuity, representing centuries of duty and sacrifice, the visible thread connecting monarchs past to the present crown. Their loss was more than a scandal. It risked staining Elizabeth's legacy forever, replacing honor with suspicion and trust with betrayal. And as Anne's investigation deepened, it became clear the truth was far more dangerous than anyone inside the palace had dared to imagine. Now, how could jewels meant to honor Elizabeth's legacy become weapons of betrayal? And what secret power struggle was Anne truly confronting? Keep watching. The Confrontation. At Clarence house, the deeper Anne's investigation went, the heavier the burden of truth became. Testimonies continued to surface, each one more damning than the last. One former staff member recalled a moment so vivid it could not be forgotten. Diana's unmistakable pearl bracelet, a wedding gift from the Spencer family, carefully placed into a velvet-lined case and quietly sent toward Mill house. For Anne, this was no longer about rumors or speculation. It was a deliberate erasure of memory, of history, of everything her mother had worked to preserve. But Anne also knew the limits of her own voice. As the sister of the king and daughter of Elizabeth II, her word carried weight, but accusations of this scale required something more than outrage. They demanded proof. Determined, she began compiling every scrap of evidence into a meticulous dossier, each detail building a narrative that was impossible to ignore. What she uncovered not only enraged her, it strengthened her resolve. The time for quiet suspicion was over. A confrontation was inevitable, and it would not take place in secrecy. It would happen in the very heart of the royal circle, where silence could no longer shield the truth. That moment arrived at Clarence house. The atmosphere was heavy, every hallway echoing with the weight of anticipation. Anne arrived with her dossier firmly in hand, her face set with the determination of someone who had carried both grief and anger for far too long. Behind the doors of a private sitting room, she came face to face with Queen Camilla. What followed, witnesses later described as nothing short of electrifying. Anne's words were sharp, measured, and unrelenting. Piece by piece, she laid out the evidence before Camilla as though presenting a case to a jury. Photos of jewels once documented in the royal archives.
Team in Rio is the places is probably more open.
Shipping manifests showing suspicious late-night deliveries, statements from loyal staff, and auction pages displaying items that bore an uncanny resemblance to the missing heirlooms. All of it was placed in front of the Queen. There was no speculation, only facts, only proof. Her ultimatum was as direct as it was devastating. Return Queen Elizabeth's jewels or face public exposure. If Anne carried out her threat, the consequences would go far beyond embarrassment. The jewels represented more than wealth. They embodied trust, tradition, and continuity. To lose them in scandal would strike at the very core of Camilla's fragile reputation as queen consort. Those present described the air in that room as icy, the silence cut only by Anne's unwavering voice and Camilla's strained attempt at composure. For Camilla, the ultimatum was a perilous turning point. Backing down meant admitting guilt. Resisting meant risking destruction. She chose resistance. Behind closed doors, Camilla turned to King Charles, reframing the confrontation as the outburst of a paranoid, unstable sister-in-law. She painted herself as the victim of Anne's vindictiveness, insisting that her accuser was emotional, erratic, and a threat to the monarchy's unity. According to whispers within the palace, Camilla even began drafting quiet plans to limit Anne's royal duties, a strategy to sideline her influence before the scandal spiraled beyond control. But Anne was not a woman easily silenced. Her fury had transformed into purpose, and with the truth in her hands, she was prepared to go further than anyone expected. But what if Anne's relentless pursuit of truth shattered Camilla's crown forever? Could Elizabeth's final word rewrite the monarchy's destiny? Stay tuned. The Queen's final word. The standoff between Anne and Camilla had already reached a fever pitch when a discovery emerged that changed everything. Hidden deep within Balmoral, among Queen Elizabeth II's private papers, lay a sealed letter written in her own hand. Its contents were nothing short of explosive. In it, Elizabeth named Princess Anne as the rightful guardian of her jewels, placing upon her daughter the solemn duty of protecting them for generations yet to come. More than a formality, it was a mother's final instruction. But the letter went even further. For Anne, reading her mother's voice from beyond the grave was like hearing a thunderclap break through the storm. In that instant, her mission was no longer based on suspicion or loyalty alone. She was carrying out her mother's last wish. With Elizabeth's letter in hand, Anne held not only evidence, but a moral authority that Camilla could not easily undermine. What had been a private clash behind closed doors now erupted into a matter far too large to contain. Word of the missing jewels and Elizabeth's sealed letter began to seep from palace walls. At first, it was the quiet chatter of insiders. Then, journalists caught the scent of a scandal too monumental to ignore. Within days, the headlines burned across newspapers and television screens worldwide. Priceless royal heirlooms missing, and Queen Camilla accused of concealing them. The public reaction was immediate, fierce, and unforgiving. These were not mere ornaments, they were symbols of continuity, crowns and jewels that had graced Elizabeth at coronations, state visits, and moments of national pride. Their disappearance touched a deep nerve, a collective wound that left the nation asking how treasures of such importance could vanish under Camilla's watch. Pressure mounted. Demands for transparency and accountability grew louder with every news cycle. And then, an unexpected voice joined the storm. From across the Atlantic, Prince Harry released personal letters written by his late mother, Princess Diana. Among the passages was one that cut like a blade. Confirmation that Diana's beloved pearl bracelet, an intimate gift from the Spencer family, had been locked away in Camilla's private vault. The revelation struck like lightning. This was no longer only about Elizabeth's jewels. It was now tied directly to Diana, one of the most cherished figures in modern royal history. Her words carried a weight that transcended palace politics. Harry's choice to make them public ignited the scandal further, turning it into a global reckoning. It was no longer about diamonds and pearls. It was about memory, betrayal, and whether the monarchy itself could be trusted to safeguard its past. Across the world, commentators framed the unfolding drama as a battle for the very soul of the crown. Was the monarchy preserving its legacy, or was it being eroded from within? Anne's determination to defend her mother's honor resonated with millions who felt, in some way, that their own history was being stolen. Inside the palace, however, the walls were closing in on Camilla. Advisors who once defended her began to distance themselves, unwilling to be dragged down by a scandal spiraling beyond control. King Charles himself found no escape from the storm. Caught between his sister's unshakable evidence and his wife's desperate denials, he faced a torment that struck at the very core of loyalty, love, and the survival of the monarchy. And behind every closed door, arguments raged like fire about truth, legacy, and whether the crown could endure the fractures tearing it apart. So how did loyalty, love, and legacy collide at Balmoral? And could this reckoning unravel the monarchy itself? The reckoning at Balmoral. Anne understood that quiet words and discreet meetings had achieved all they could. The time for diplomacy had ended. If the truth was to have its full weight, it had to be laid bare in a place that carried Elizabeth's memory like no other. Balmoral Castle. The estate was more than stone walls and sweeping grounds. It was Elizabeth's sanctuary, the place where she found peace and strength away from the world's gaze. To confront betrayal, there would be both symbolic and final. When Anne arrived, she carried with her the full weight of months of work. The dossier she had built, thick with photographs, testimonies, and shipping records, was no longer just evidence. It was a weapon of truth. And at its heart lay the most powerful piece of all, Elizabeth's sealed letter, written in her own hand, naming Anne guardian of the jewels and warning Camilla not to claim them. Inside Balmoral's private chamber, the royal family gathered in tense silence. Those present would later describe the atmosphere as suffocating. Camilla sat rigidly, her face betraying the strain of holding her composure. Charles shifted uneasily in his chair, visibly torn between his loyalty to his wife and the undeniable force of his sister's case. Around them, the portraits of ancestors seemed to stare down, silent witnesses to a moment that would shape the monarchy's future. Anne began not with anger, but with calm, steady authority. Piece by piece, she laid out the case, her words measured but unrelenting. Photographs of jewels long documented in the royal archives, but now missing. Testimonies from staff who recalled midnight transfers of velvet-lined cases to Raymill House. Auction records from Europe and the Middle East show items that match perfectly with Elizabeth's heirlooms. Each document, each voice, each detail stacked higher and higher, leaving less room for doubt, less space for denial. The confrontation stretched on for hours. Camilla tried to resist. She denied. She deflected. She dismissed the accusations as mere errors in record-keeping. But with every denial, Anne pressed forward. Staff statements contradicted Camilla's words directly. Auction catalogs bore images that mirrored the missing jewels in unmistakable detail. And Elizabeth's letter, sharp in its clarity, cut through every excuse. The late Queen's voice, preserved in ink, stood as the final judgment no one could challenge.
And I need to say that, because...
By the time Anne finished, the chamber fell into silence so deep it seemed to echo through the castle walls. The truth was no longer hidden. Every person in that room knew it. The jewels had been taken, concealed, and in some cases, sold. They were never Camilla's to claim. They were threads of history, treasures meant to preserve the continuity of the crown. Elizabeth's wish had been simple and absolute. They were to remain safeguarded for the future. At last, under the weight of evidence and the authority of Elizabeth's words, Camilla's resistance faltered. Her shoulders dropped, her gaze lowered, and the fight that had once burned behind her composure slipped away. In that chamber, at Balmoral, the reckoning had come. How did jewels meant to safeguard Elizabeth's legacy ignite a reckoning so fierce it tore duty from blood? Can loyalty survive betrayal? Stay glued. When duty tore the family apart. Under the crushing force of undeniable proof and the unshakable authority of Queen Elizabeth's final words, Camilla could no longer fight. She relented. One by one, the treasures that had quietly slipped into the shadows were ordered back into royal hands. The Victorian diamond brooch, the sapphire necklace, the emerald choker, Diana's luminous pearls, alongside countless other heirlooms, were to be restored to the vaults where they belonged. But even as each jewel found its way home, the truth lingered like a wound that refused to heal. The treasures could be returned, but trust would not. For Anne, the triumph at Balmoral came at a cost heavier than any crown. The confrontation had safeguarded her mother's legacy, but it had also ripped apart what remained of fragile family bonds. Camilla's reputation, already precarious in the public eye, was left battered and exposed, her image reduced to ashes before the world.
I've been actually trying to keep quiet about reaching 3/4 of a century.
Yet Anne did not fight for appearances, nor for recognition. She fought because her mother had entrusted her with a duty that transcended personal cost. This was not about power, it was about protecting the soul of the monarchy. The atmosphere at Balmoral was thick with memory. The estate had long been Elizabeth's refuge, a place where she found solace away from the world's glare. Now, those same walls bore witness to a reckoning that had changed everything. The jewels, once teetering on the edge of vanishing forever, had been pulled back into the crown's embrace. Still, the echoes of betrayal clung to them. Every piece carried with it a new, unsettling story. The Victorian diamond brooch, pinned so often to Elizabeth's gown during banquets of state, had nearly slipped away into anonymity. The sapphire necklace, a dazzling chain that sparkled through centuries of history, came close to being lost in the abyss of private collections. The emerald choker, a jewel threaded through generations of queens, had been hidden from sight, severed from the very continuity it was meant to symbolize. And Diana's pearls, perhaps the most haunting of all, stood as silent witnesses to both love and tragedy. Once worn as emblems of grace, they had been reduced to bargaining chips in a scheme that shook the monarchy's core. Though they were back, none of them was untouched. They bore invisible scars of secrecy and betrayal. Through it all, Anne remained unflinching. Her resolve had not wavered, even as the confrontation cut deep into her family. She had walked a lonely path, armed only with evidence, courage, and the sealed letter her mother had left behind. That letter was more than a written will. It was Elizabeth's voice from beyond, urging her daughter to protect what mattered most. In Anne's hands, it became both compass and shield. With every word read, it reminded her that the crown was not merely an institution, but a legacy built on memory, sacrifice, and duty. But fulfilling that sacred duty came with consequences. Balmoral's chambers echoed with more than resolution. They carried fractures that would never mend. The rift between Anne and Camilla was absolute, a divide that could never be bridged. Within the family, silence became as revealing as speech. Those who chose not to take sides marked themselves as cautious, perhaps complicit, and at the center of it all stood Charles, uneasy, torn between loyalty to his sister and devotion to his wife. His indecision lingered like a shadow, raising a question no one dared ask aloud. How much had he known, and how much had he chosen not to see? But what if the jewels themselves held the answers? Did they expose betrayal, or simply magnify a silence the crown could never contain? You won't want to miss this part. When the jewels spoke louder than the crown. For Camilla, the aftermath was brutal. She may have remained by Charles's side, crowned and titled, but her public standing crumbled under the weight of suspicion. No longer was she seen as a custodian of royal heritage. Instead, she was cast as someone who had sought to profit from it. Whispers of a hidden vault at Raymill House persisted, no matter how fiercely she denied them, and the memories of her earlier attempts to portray Anne as unstable now looked, in hindsight, like deliberate and calculated manipulation. The jewels had been brought back, restored to their rightful place, yet mistrust hung over her every step, every smile, every appearance in public. Those once loyal to her began to retreat. Courtiers and allies, wary of being tarnished by association, quietly distanced themselves. In the press, the story grew beyond the simple matter of missing treasures. It became a debate about integrity, duty, and the monarchy's role in safeguarding a nation's history. These heirlooms were not just adornments, they were chapters of Britain's collective memory. The mere thought that they could have been hidden away for personal gain was unthinkable to many. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. Beyond Britain's borders, international media turned the affair into a cautionary tale. Newspapers and broadcasters across Europe and America framed it as a lesson in how legacy can fracture from within, not through enemies or invaders, but through betrayal in the heart of the institution itself. Historians, museum curators, and cultural guardians, while relieved that the treasures were rescued, admitted their shock that such a violation could happen at all. They spoke of how close these priceless pieces had come to being lost to private collectors and faceless auctions, erased from the public story of the monarchy forever. Then came a voice from the past that deepened the storm. Diana's letters, released by Harry, echoed into the present with painful clarity. Among them was the revelation of her pearl bracelet, so personal, so symbolic, discovered among the pieces hidden away in Camilla's private vault. That disclosure shifted the scandal from the realm of politics and palace intrigue to something far more emotional. The pearls were not just jewels. They were a fragment of Diana's life, her memory, her story. To the public, their concealment was not just theft, but an act of disrespect to her legacy. Diana's words, combined with Anne's steadfast defiance, gave the entire saga the weight of a moral struggle. It was no longer about crowns or protocol, it was about truth, loyalty, and betrayal. The jewels eventually returned to their velvet-lined cases in the royal vaults, their brilliance untarnished to the naked eye. But the truth was undeniable. They were no longer innocent ornaments. They had become witnesses. Every time the Victorian diamond brooch is pinned to a royal gown, every time Diana's pearls are worn again, they will carry with them the haunting memory of how close they came to being lost. Each sparkle will remind both the family and the public of the storm that nearly consumed them. And so, the true legacy of the scandal was never about the gems themselves. It lay in the people who fought and in those who faltered. Anne, armed with her mother's sealed letter, emerged as the guardian Elizabeth believed her to be: loyal, unwavering, fearless. Camilla, despite surrendering the jewels, walked away with her reputation scarred, marked by suspicion that time may never erase. As for the monarchy, it was forced to confront a painful truth. History can be stolen not by enemies outside the gates, but by those entrusted to protect it. Its survival depends not only on vaults and locks, but on the honor and integrity of those who hold its keys. At Balmoral, the late Queen's presence seemed to linger in every corner of that fateful confrontation. Her voice, etched into her letter, preserved in memory, became the final verdict. It rang louder than Camilla's denials, louder than the headlines in the press, louder even than the divisions that tore the family apart. Anne carried that voice into the future, ensuring Elizabeth's will was fulfilled. The jewels remain. The monarchy endures, but the shadow of how near they came to slipping away will never fade. It is a chapter etched into history, a reminder that even in the most gilded halls, truth has a way of rising, and when it does, it cannot be silenced. So, what do you think? Was Princess Anne the true guardian of Elizabeth's legacy? Or has Queen Camilla's shadow forever tainted the crown's jewels? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.